440 Hz. That's the number, not a range, not an approximation. 440 vibrations per second. It's the clean, precise, unquestioned sound of the note A above middle C when an orchestra tunes. This is the note they tune to. It's the reference tone for countless instruments made around the world. It feels less like a choice and more like a law of physics. The question in the title seems to point to a specific moment when this law was enacted. A moment in 1939 when every tuning fork in America was replaced. It suggests an official decree, a recall, a sudden, top-down decision to unify the sound of a nation. But what if the entire premise is wrong? The truth is, there was no government mandate, no sweeping recall of old tuning forks. The story of 1939 is not about a physical replacement. It is about a silent one. The real story isn't about America being forced to change, but about how an American idea of sound eventually conquered the world. To understand it, you have to look not at 1939, but at the century of chaos that came before it. The world before 440, a Babel of Tone. Imagine being an opera singer in the mid-19th century, traveling from Paris to London. In Paris, the orchestra tunes to a standard called the diapason normal, an A set at 435 Hz. It was a pitch established by the French government in 1859, a commission that included composers like Berlioz and Rossini. It was the closest thing to an international standard that existed. But when you arrive in London, you find the orchestra's pitch is noticeably higher, and in another city higher still. This is the phenomenon of pitch inflation, a historical tendency for pitch to creep upwards over decades, driven by instrument makers and orchestras competing for a brighter, more brilliant sound. For a singer, this is a disaster. A high note that was comfortable in France becomes a strain in England. This wasn't just a problem for singers. It was a problem for anyone making or selling musical instruments. A piano built to sound its best at 455 Hz in London would sound dull or need stressful retuning to be played alongside a French orchestra at 435 Hz. The sound of Europe was a mosaic of competing, incompatible standards. The French diapason normal of 1859 was the first major attempt to solve this chaos. But by the early 20th century, a new force was rising, one that cared less about artistic tradition and more about a different principle entirely: mass production. On the factory floors of American industry here, a man named John C. Deegan was building a business making xylophones, bells, and other percussion instruments. Deegan was an inventor and an industrialist. His problem was commercial, not artistic. To sell instruments efficiently across America and abroad, they all had to be tuned to the exact same standard. A patchwork of local pitches was bad for business. So he became a forceful advocate for a single, uniform pitch. In 1925, years before any international conference, the American musical instrument industry, led by Deegan, informally adopted a equals 440 Hz as its standard. It was a decision driven by industrial pragmatism. It made manufacturing simpler, cheaper, and more scalable. American-made pianos, clarinets, and xylophones were now being built for a 440 Hz world. This wasn't a secret. Deegan published pamphlets arguing his case. It was an open campaign for industrial standardization. Then a new technology amplified the need for a single standard: radio. In 1929, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, began broadcasting a 440 Hz tone for orchestras to tune to. Suddenly, the problem was no longer confined to a single concert hall. A radio broadcast could be heard by millions. For an orchestra in a London studio to sound correct in homes across the country, a single, reliable reference pitch was essential. The BBC chose the emerging American industrial standard, 440 Hz. The stage was now set. On one side, the established European artistic standard of 435 Hz. On the other, the industrially backed, technologically convenient American standard of 440 Hz. Only one could become the global benchmark. In May of 1939, on the very eve of the Second World War, the British Standards Institution hosted an international conference in London. Its goal was to finally recommend a single, international standard for concert pitch. Delegates arrived from France, Germany, Great Britain, Holland, Italy, Switzerland, and the USA. Imagine the scene: a tense, wood-paneled room with representatives from nations that would be at war in a matter of months, gathered to debate the frequency of a musical note. But this wasn't really a debate about art. It was a negotiation between established tradition and burgeoning industrial power. The French delegate argued for their A equals 435 Hz, the historic diapason normal. But the American delegation had a stronger hand. They could point to the fact that their entire, massive music industry had been using A equals 440 Hz for over a decade. They could point to the powerful BBC, which was already broadcasting the 440 Hz tone daily. The German delegate, it's worth noting, also supported 440 Hz, based on recommendations from their own acousticians from 1938 who saw the logic in the American standard. But the idea, sometimes floated in modern conspiracy theories, that this was a Nazi-imposed frequency is not supported by the records of the conference. The push was commercial and technological, led by the US and the UK. The vote was taken. The recommendation was made. A equals 440 Hz would be the new international standard. It was not a law, it was a technical agreement, but it was the tipping point. The victory was later formalized in 1955 when the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, codified the standard as ISO 16. So what, if anything, was lost? Decades before the London Conference, in 1884, the composer Giuseppe Verdi wrote a letter concerning a music conservatory. He expressed a strong preference for a pitch of A equals 432 Hz. His reasoning was practical and artistic. He was concerned about what pitch inflation was doing to the straining voices of singers. He felt a lower pitch had a more appropriate character for his music. Verdi's concern is the historical root of a modern movement that advocates for a return to 432 Hz, often attaching metaphysical or healing properties to the frequency. While the historical record supports Verdi's aesthetic and vocal arguments, it does not support the more recent claims. Another claim you might encounter is that the 440 Hz standard was promoted by the Nazi regime for sinister purposes. This idea was popularized in the 1980s by a political group called the Schiller Institute, who campaigned to revert to a Verdi pitch of 432 Hz. But primary sources from the 1939 London Conference, attended by Britain, France, and the US, simply don't support this. The decision for 440 Hz was pragmatic, not conspiratorial. The real replacement of 1939 wasn't the physical act of swapping out every tuning fork. It was the victory of a single idea, industrial uniformity, over a complex mosaic of traditions. The sound of our world was unified not by a dictator, but by a committee, a factory floor, and a radio broadcast.